This screencast is going to look at Doyle Dairies, which is an exam standard question in the area of activity-based costing. Now I'll assume that you'll have read through the question, so if not, please pause the video and have a good read through it and even attempt it before you look at this screencast. It's important to make an attempt at questions before you actually look and audit the solution. My first advice to students is always to read the requirements first, because that will inform you in terms of what's actually required from the question, so when you're reading it you know what to expect, and also then it will inform you in terms of how much time you can allocate based on the marks available. So in this part A, you're asked to calculate the manufacturing cost based on the traditional costing system for corn and more cheese and Insalaga ice. Likewise for ABC system in part B, manufacturing cost and selling price. And finally then you have to write a memo to management in terms of explaining the differences and outlining the implications for production mix and competitiveness strategies. So it's important here about the and. Make sure you read the requirements carefully. So we'll first start off with the traditional costing system. So you'll have read down through it. It produces a wide range of dairy products, and in terms of here we're looking at two particular products, a cheese product and an ice product. So the first thing you look at is the traditional systems use a traditional costing system which traces manufacturing costs to products and absorbs manufacturing overhead using a single rate, direct labour time. So you know the rate now, or the cost driver is direct labour time. Manufacturing overhead for 2012 was 10 million and 250,000 direct labour hours. So going back, what's the typical steps? In a traditional system, we look at 1, establish the overhead, and in this case we already know it's 10 million from the question. Second step, cost driver, and in this instance we typically use a volume-based driver, in this instance direct labour time. So we know it's 250,000 direct labour hours. You can put here DLH. Next it is rate per driver unit. So here we're essentially saying, well, for every hour that's used in a product, how much overhead are we going to allocate? So that is essentially the overheads over the number of drivers units, i.e. direct labour hours. So we're allocating in this instance, for every 1 direct labour hour a product uses, we're going to give it 40 euro of an overhead as well. And for the final step then is allocate to product. So now we're going to back up. Again, it's useful in this instance to go back down and to set it up and send the table just to make sure it's neat. Direct materials is fairly straightforward. We know it's 0.15 per unit for Carnmore cheese, and for the ice product we know it's 0.25 per unit. Direct labour, now this is the type of thing to expect in the exam, just to make sure students are keeping on the ball and reading the information that is provided. So you will see the direct labour, you're actually given time per unit, not cost per unit. So students will have to figure out then, well, what is the rate per hour of direct labour? And actually, if you had read the question carefully, it's given to you up here. 250,000 direct labour hours were worked at a total labour cost of 5 million. Therefore, if we know the total labour cost, which is 5 million, we know the number of hours, which is up here, so we can get the rate per hour based on 5 million divided by 250,000. So the actual labour rate per hour is 20 euro. And we know each unit takes 2 minutes. Alright, so 2 minutes, so you can do equals 2 over 60, 60 minutes in an hour, times 20. So essentially they're going to use about 0.67 for every unit in terms of labour cost. And you'll notice that it's the same for here, 2 over 60, they still use 2 minutes, times your 20 euro. Let's change that. So now you've figured out the direct materials, which is fairly straightforward, is given to you, and also direct labour, which you had to work indirectly to figure out, well, what was the labour rate, and then apply it to the actual product per unit. So this will give us direct cost. So similar to the OLATA question we did before, we now know our direct cost per unit. Let's put this here to format it, is 82 cent and 92 cent. But now we need to, well, what about overheads? Apologies. We now need to allocate the overhead of 10 million based on some allocation method, and we already know, we've worked it out, it's going to be €40 per unit. So €40, sorry, per direct labour hour. So here, we know we're not using the full 1 hour, we're using 2/60 of the hour, times the 40, and we're allocating there €1.33 in overheads. So just format these, so make sure they're the same. Likewise, for ice product, we're going to allocate again, you're only using 2 minutes of the 60, times the 40, so that actually means allocated the same amount of overhead. So now we have our direct cost of 82, plus our indirect cost of 133, getting us to a total product cost per unit of 215 for corn and mold cheese and 225 for Insalaga ice. Okay, so again, fairly straightforward in terms of part A. You essentially use the traditional method of only one cost driver, direct labour hours, and you allocate to each of the products. Now don't forget, again, read the question, you're also asked the selling price. And you're told here, Doyle Dairies sets the prices of all products of the manufacturing cost per unit plus a markup. And this is an important term here, is markup. Okay, of 30%. The markup essentially means you put the markup based on the cost. So markup of 30%. So here you're going to add on 30%. Apologies, no I'm not going on. 65 cents and 68. Just putting them up. So essentially now what you're going to do is, well, you want to mark up the cost by 30%, therefore you're going to have the cost plus the markup, which gives you your selling price. You're selling that for 280, and you're going to sell the ice product for 293. So your standard product that's particularly high volume is going to cost 280 in the market, and 293 is what your premium product is going to sell for. So that's important. And I'll just add a few lines here. One thing I want students in particular to pay attention to is the difference between markup versus margin. Now this will be important, particularly in your continuous assessment. So the markup is essentially based on cost. So how much are you marking up your cost to get to a profit? Margin, on the other hand, is relative to the selling price. So whereas the markup is 30%, the margin is in fact the 65-cent profit you're making over and above your costs over the selling price. So your margin in this instance is 23%, and likewise it will be the same for Insalaga ice, and that your margin you're making is a consistent 23%. So that distinction is important, particularly when you go on and look at your CA, continuous assessment. Okay, so now we've done the first part, the manufacturing cost based on the traditional costing system. However, now we want to look a bit more detail in terms of, let's look using the activity-based costing system, both the manufacturing cost and the selling price again. So again, we know from before we can take all of these direct costs, these will be directly applicable to the ABC system as well, and we'll bring these over here. So we're looking at per unit. These costs are the exact same under the ABC system. Now I'll add these back just to be consistent. 67 and 67. So they don't change, they're the direct costs. They've always been applicable. What will change is your overhead allocation. And to look at that, we have to look at, well, of that 10 million, what goes on in the company. So again, instead of just looking at the 10 million, same as Orlata and Eurovudas, we'll break down the 10 million into its core activities. So materials handling, about a fifth, quality control, another fifth, packaging, a quarter, mixing about a fifth, and resting time, you're talking about a tenth of the overheads. And based on that then of costing and of the cost driver, so it's not just direct labour hours anymore, you're looking at setups, which is not volume based, it's transaction based, batches, inputs, number of hours, resting hours, and number of delivery trays used. So a lot more granular information that'll be very useful in terms of getting a bit more accurate estimation of how much of the overheads are used by each of the products. So I'll put this down here already in terms of this is just transcription of what this table is here. And now we want to figure out, well, for each cost driver, how much is the cost per unit. So 2.1 million of materials handling over the number of setups which drive that essentially says for every setup it's costing you €800. And you can do the same down along, so you can take your time with the calculator, make a pause. I'm just doing it on Excel. So for every production run used, it's €500 per batch. For every number of ingredients or inputs, it's 190. For every resting hour, it costs you €100 in overheads. And for every delivery tray, that should be 2.5. Every delivery tray used, it's costing you €2.5 in packaging. So this is very useful information because we can take this then and apply it to the information we have for our two particular products in terms of, well, how many setups do they use? How many batches or units are per batch? How much resting time do they have per unit? So all this information is very useful, and what we're going to do now is try and allocate the overhead to both Cornamo cheese and Insalaga ice. So if we start with CC first and then II. So looking at CC in terms of materials, well, we know materials handling is based on number of setups. It's €800 per setup, and Cornamo cheese uses 100 setups. Okay, so it's 800 times 100 gets you to 80,000 allocation. So I'll just format these to make sure they're all similar. Okay, so CC gets 80,000. Same approach for the ice product. You start off with it's 800 per setup, and how many setups do they use? Well, they actually use 70 setups. So it's 800 times 70. That gets you to 56,000. Okay, so that's materials allocated. Now, don't get confused because many people were wondering, well, actually, that's only 170 setups, and the total number of setups is 2625. Just remember that this is only two products. They make 30 products in total, so you're only looking at two of those products. This isn't the total, but there's a number of other products which you're not worried about. You're just literally looking at the allocation to two particular products. So finished with materials. Now we're going to move on to quality control. So we call it QC. This driver is based on the number of batches. So for every batch, it's costing 500. All right. So 500 per batch times, now are we told the number of batches here? We're actually not told the number of batches. We're told the number of units and the number of units per batch. So again, just a bit more difficult in terms of figuring out how do you actually calculate it. So it's 5 million over 10,000 means the number of batches for Cornamo cheese is actually 500. So you're allocating 250,000 towards Cornamo cheese. Likewise for Insalaga ice, it's the 500 of cost per batch times, you know, there's 300,000 units and only 500 units per batch, so very small batch runs that are made here. So that means there's actually 600 batches here. So they actually get allocated more than the high volume product. Okay, so that's two allocated. The next one then is mixing. Same approach again. The number of ingredients, it's €190 per ingredient or input. In the cheese we have 700, and in the ice product we have 500. So relatively straightforward. Resting time. Resting time, it is €100 per resting hour. So times, now again, they don't tell you the number of hours resting time, they tell you resting time per production. So the point is, per production essentially means per batch. So per production run, per batch. So it's 0.5 times the number of batches, which we told was 500. So a bit difficult there, just makes you work a bit harder in terms of figure out what's going on. You have to pay attention to the level of detail given. Likewise, in terms of resting time, it's still €100 per resting hour times 1 hour per batch, and the number of batches is 600. So that will get you to 60,000. So far fairly straightforward in terms of same approach as Olata. The only difficulty is there may be a small bit of work to figure out the relevant information from the table given. So what we finally want to look at then is packaging, and this is based on €2.50 per tray, because that's what we know the cost driver is for this cost pool, times, and you're told the number of packaging down here. Delivery trays, 50,000 trays for cheese, and then €2.50 times 30,000 for ice. So that's essentially your overhead allocated. So you now add that up, 613,000 for cheese and 586,000 for the ice product. Right? And we'll put them, center them, and then we want to say, well, that's the total number of units. Well, the number of units here we're told is up here, 5 million, and the number of units here is 300,000. So based then, we get a cost per unit or overhead per unit. Here it will be 613,000 over 5 million, which is about 13 cents per unit, or 12 cents per unit if we round down. And here it will be 586,000 over 300,000, so actually 195 per unit. So we're going to take these figures of the overhead per unit and we work back up to the table that we had. This was here. We said this was 0.12 per unit and this was 1.95. So based on that then we'll add them up. Direct costs plus indirect costs gives us total cost, and likewise here. And I'll just format these as up here. Let's put it on. So now we have cost per unit. So don't forget, you also have to get up the selling price similar to the previous requirement. So markup is the same. And you say the markup here is times 0.3 and the markup here is times 3. So that gives you 30% markup. So that's just to determine what the sales price is. So that based on the ABC costing system, we're saying the selling price is, well, that's the total cost plus my markup gets me a selling price of €1.22. And likewise for the ice product, we're saying cost $2.87, markup 86 cents, therefore my selling price will be €3.73. So now you've essentially done part A, which is the selling price in the traditional system, and part B, the manufacturing and selling price for ABC system. So part C then asks you write a memo. So again, there will be marker 2 going for a memo, so be careful in terms of presentation and the deliverable required. Write a memo to the management team at Doyle Dairies which clearly explains the reasons. So explains is number 1 for any differences between A and B above, and outlines the implications. So explains and implications, 2 separate things. There will be marks going for each. So the first thing I would always do for part C in terms of a memo, so let's put C here, is the first thing you want to do is I put a little table in just to summarize the calculations that you'll have done and to make it neat and clear when you are providing the memo to the management team of what your actual results are. So you'll say costs per traditional and then costs per ABC. So if we say the product cost for the traditional, we can go over here, is $2.15 and $2.25. So this is, we'll just copy down these headings. So for Carmore cheese, the cost per traditional method is $2.15 and in Salagas ice is $2.25. However, the cost here for ABC is only 94 cents and $2.87. Okay. So if I was looking at the cost only, and you can look at the selling price as well, it tells you the exact same thing because the relationship is only 30%. I may even put in, the good students may even put in the difference of the quantum. So here, it's a percentage. The cost per ABC is only 44% of the cost per the traditional. So a big fall down in terms of what the cost is for your Carnmore cheese. And likewise, if we do the same analysis for Insallig Ice, they're actually 27% increased. So it suggests corn and more cheese was overcosted based on the traditional method, and obviously subsequently it was overpriced. And then for Insallig Ice, it was undercosted in the traditional method and subsequently obviously underpriced. So that's essentially looking at the difference. Now we want to say, well, what explains that difference? Well, if we go back and we look at how we allocated overheads based on the traditional method, we essentially said, well, look, every unit is getting the exact same. Because they consume direct labour hours in the same proportion, i.e. 2 minutes each, we are allocating them the same overhead. Whereas when we go to the activity-based costing method, there's a wildly different allocation, and it would be good students that would bring up that difference, comparing the overhead allocation for the traditional and the ABC method. And then they will link, well, actually, when you look at the cost pools that are identified, and you look at the relative consumption of activities that drive costs, there's nothing, they're not comparable in terms of allocating the same to corn more cheese as Insallig Ice. For example, even though corn more cheese does 5,000 or 5 million units, it only does 100 setups. Whereas Insallig Ice only uses 300,000 units, but it does 70 setups, so nearly as much as the cheese product, despite it being vastly a multiple of less units. Same goes for inputs, same goes for production batch sizes in terms of number of batches. Number of batches here was 500, number of batches here was 600. So although the high volume products do not have units, it is the resource usage in terms of the different activities which the ice product takes a lot of, and therefore if it consumes a lot of activities, it should therefore be allocated a lot of the overhead. So now that essentially explains, well, why is there a difference? Well, the main difference is the current traditional method does not appreciate what is actually driving manufacturing overhead, i.e. the various 5 cost pools, and also it doesn't differentiate between the actual usage of overheads in terms of the different activities that Insallig Ice takes a lot more of relative to corn and more cheese. Hence the big differential in terms of the prices and the costings for the two systems. And the final part, don't forget, here is the implications. Well, one of the implications already we've said is, look, one of your products is going to be overcosted in the market, i.e. corn and more cheese, and subsequently based on your pricing method, i.e. markup with 30%, it will also be overpriced. And if you link back to the question, you're getting information back following complaints from long-standing customers regarding recent price increases. So good students will link back in that implication in terms of how the pricing system and your pricing approach is affecting your market. As well, you're looking at the Insallig Ice one, it's actually underpriced or undercosted based on the traditional system, and therefore you look at actually you need to up the price on that to make it as profitable as you think it could be. Finally, what students could do in terms of, well, what are the other implications? Well, you have to link on with your marketing teams to consider, well, one, how are we going to move price, if at all, particularly in terms of the one that's underpriced, the ice product. That is very marginally profitable now. And the second thing then you have to also look at is, well, you can't just base it on this, you will have to look at market trends, your competitive position, and determine what's the most appropriate action. Final things good students may do is compare current price. So compare the current price based on the traditional system. So we said we're going to charge $2.80 for corn and more cheese, and you're going to charge $2.93 for Insallig Ice based on the ABC cost. So typically what the approach I'm thinking here is, the traditional system is used to set the current price, so this is more than likely going to be the current price in the market. This is the realistic cost per unit of 94 and of 287, and then you can see profit per unit. So the profit per unit here is actually very high, it's 186, whereas the profit per unit here is actually very low, only 6 cents per unit. So the point is here, I want to illustrate that in your current system you assume that the margin, which we worked out, you're making 23% on every unit sold. Whereas here it's wildly different based on the realistic costs based on the activity-based costing system. So you can look at your margin in terms of, well, for every unit sold we make a profit of 186 over the current price, which is assumed to be the price in the market, 66% margin. Whereas the margin on our ICE product is actually only 2%. So vastly different, and it's those types of commercial insights that would be expected for Part C for 15 marks. So you're thinking a mark or two for presentation because you're asked for a memo. You're asked to make the explanation in terms of, well, why is there a differential? Well, there's a differential based on, well, what are the assumptions in terms of traditional system, and how does that differ in terms of resource usage when you look at activity-based costing. And finally, then they outline the implications, and this is where your managerial hat comes on. Well, we're under costing and we're over costing. This is affecting our pricing. We're getting complaints from our customers, and also the good students will then go on and say, well, actually, the profitability of each product based on our current system and the pricing we use and the updated costs are vastly different than we would have imagined based on our estimates of a 23% margin. So based on that, then you may have to consider your product mix in terms of, well, are we going to focus now on the Carnamore cheese, which is the old and most popular product, so it's the high volume, but you look at it by this, it's also the most profitable, or are you going to focus now on the gourmet and try and do some lever in terms of how you can improve profitability, perhaps through activity-based management, which again we're going to look at in the current week's session, or alternatively increasing the price for your product. So again, that was Doyle Dairies, an exam standard question on activity-based costing, and it should be useful for you in your revision of section 2.